I live in southern Maine, out in the sticks. There's an upper part of our garage, detached from the house. When I was around 14 years old during the summer, I'd sleep up there to hide smoking Mary J from my dad. Some nights out here, knocking on the door, and this wasn't like branches rubbing up against the structure. These were distinct knocks. I was terrified, and I was so young I didn't know what to do at the time. I knew the door was locked. I wasn't sure about the actual garage door, though. I somehow managed to fall asleep and awoke still alive and breathing, but this kept happening randomly throughout the night. Nothing serious happened. It was just those knocks. They sounded and felt so intentional, like something wanted me to be scared. It would be like knock, 2 seconds of silence, another knock followed by another 2 seconds of silence, and then another knock. So eventually, the knocking started when I had a friend over. So we were in there, and it was the two of us. We have machetes and axes, so we went downstairs, and the knocks are still going. As we got to the door, neither of us wanted to open it, so we just sat there and listened. There's a rundown red SUV, Explorer-type vehicle next to the garage. We heard the suspension go down, like a bear sat on it or something. We just both looked at each other like, what the hell? And went back upstairs and just tried to forget about it. I set traps from where I thought it was coming from. The knocks kept happening up until I started staying inside again. I've had nightmares of the place I lived, of a pale, giant, centipede-looking creature with long black hair that can walk on water. I was talking with someone on an island in the dream, but I don't remember what was said. But all I know is this creature comes around the bend of the island. I hit it with a shovel, and then I wake up. I apologize if this is too much and kind of confusing. I love your channel and have been watching for a while. It's awesome to watch it grow, and I hope somebody might know what could have been knocking on my door that night. I did see a silhouette of it. It was hard to make out if it was hominid or not, but I just really would like answers. A couple of years ago, my girlfriend and I were camping in the Pacific Northwest, between San Francisco and Portland. We had rented a car and were stopping at different campsites every night on our way from the former to the latter. The first night, we arrived at a campsite and found that it had been closed for the season, despite the fact that we looked on their website and they said that they were open. So we ended up driving around, looking for another campsite on Google Maps. But at this point, it's getting dark. We see a forest firefighter outpost and pull in to ask them if they know of any nearby. They tell us that most of them are closed for the season, but there are a couple on their old map that we haven't checked. We get back on the road and find our way to one of these campsites. The sign for this place is literally resting on the ground and is a little overgrown. But at this point, it's dark as hell, and we really don't have many other options. As we pull our car into what we think is a spot, we see a few other tents nearby, so we take it as a good sign. We get out and start to set up our things when immediately things begin to get strange. Two guys walk directly through our spot and strike up a conversation with us. Oh, if they're looking a little rough. One of them has a zip-up hoodie without a shirt underneath, and I notice that he is extremely skinny. They're also both really dirty and have messed up hair. They're both speaking very fast and seem kind of nervous. They tell us that they're actually seasonal workers nearby and are staying at this campsite to save money while they're there. While we're talking to these two guys, a decade-old white Mercedes pulls into the campsite with all four windows blasting rap music. The driver and passenger look like some real ICP enthusiasts. They look around quickly and leave immediately. At the time, I thought they were probably looking for a campsite too. The two rough dudes also leave, and we continue setting up camp. Not too long after, we get another visitor. This time, it's an older woman with a 3-pack-a-day voice. She's nice enough, but also asking us some pretty weird questions. "You guys here for the horror show?" she asks. And thinking, "What's a horror show? Do you mean the haunted house?" The lady tells us that lots of people come out for the horror show and starts warning us about all the ghouls and zombies. She eventually leaves, and my girlfriend and I agree they must be talking about some kind of haunted house nearby as it was early October. And you know, Maybe that's where the seasonal worker dudes who looked kind of scary happened to be working. In my mind, it all checked out. We start our fire, and I begin breaking out the wood when my girlfriend admits that she's freaked out. She's worried about the people that we've encountered and how strange this campsite is. She points out that there aren't really any sounds coming from anyone else's tents with the exception of the one woman who wouldn't stop coughing. No music, no children laughter, nothing. I'm starting to believe her, but at this point, it's pretty late, and we don't really have any other options. I'm also thinking that if the campsite is weird, it's just some harmless weirdos. She seems pacified by my confidence, and we continue making dinner. It's at this point that a bunch of really weird shit starts happening. The two dudes we met right when we got there emerge from the woods without any source of light and without saying a word, walking straight into their tent. They have a very short and heated discussion which I can't make out. One of them storms out of the tent and walks straight towards the older woman's campsite, making eye contact with me for an uncomfortably long amount of time. He then climbs into the cab of her pickup truck, and I realize there's already someone in there and likely has been for some time, probably the woman. You can tell that they start smoking something from when the lighter flickers. This strikes me as especially odd. You smoke cigarettes in the car, probably not at a campsite in Northern California, and I'm pretty sure there aren't any kids around. Why go into the car to do that? Then it hits me like a sack of bricks. It's meth. They were all smoking meth, and the woman was probably dealing. The level of comfort she had established in her campsite indicated that she'd been there for a while. Meth explained why everyone was looking like emaciated zombies. It explained the juggalos driving through, getting spooked and leaving. It explained the strange erratic behavior and constant coughing from everyone. This was clearly some sort of live-in meth village at a closed-down campsite in the backwoods of Northern California. It's at this moment that I realize the second guy is skulking around the edge of our campsite, clearly trying not to be seen. I concede to my girlfriend that I also want to leave. We pack up everything very slowly and normally, trying to make it look like we were just putting away food and putting our fire out for the night. With only the tent left, I tell my girlfriend to get into the car, and I get ready to back out of the spot. The second I pick up the tent, the woman's truck starts up and her lights turn on. They were blindingly bright circular lights on a rack. I throw the tent into the trunk as fast as I can and tell my girlfriend to back up. I'm standing behind the car to guide her, but also making it very clear to whoever's watching us that I have a hatchet. I was so on edge that if Mr. Rogers caught me off guard, I would have buried that thing into his skull. She throws the car into reverse, hits the pedal, but the car doesn't move. I can hear the engine revving, and I see the car lurching, but it's not going anywhere. For a split second, I think they've slashed our tires somehow. This is how horror movies start. Suddenly it hits me. The parking brake is likely on. As she backs up, gets on the main path, and I jump in the passenger seat as we drive out. We can hear them start screaming about something. Once we get onto the main road, we do a Chinese fire drill, and I drive down the road at warp speed to the first bed and breakfast that we see. It was lovely. About 10 years ago, my best friend and I decided to stop at a local hangout of ours in Bowie, Maryland. We grew up here and spent our early years wandering the railroad tracks and woods, smoking and drinking as children. So this one spot is a railroad overpass at 450 and 197. There's a parking lot in a small area of grass and trees, about a 30-foot strip of land separating the tracks and the lot. It's nighttime, and we decide to go there to smoke a cigarette. We go on the tracks and we're facing the parking lot, so the overpass is to our left, and the tracks go on our right. Now we're smoking and chilling, and he's talking, but the entire time I'm focused to my right, peering down this track because I have this strange feeling. It's hard to describe. I wouldn't know until after listening to this show that it was the feeling of being watched by a predator, which I've never experienced before this moment. After about 2 minutes or so, we're almost done smoking our cigarettes, and a helicopter flies right above us, seemingly at tree level, with the spotlight going right over us. coming into the direction of the overpass. Not even 10 seconds later, I hear the gravel shift from between the tracks, and I look toward the overpass. Standing right in the center of the overpass, there is this giant silhouette. Now, since it is dark and it's under the overpass, I can only see its silhouette. It's easily 8 or 9 feet tall and burly looking as all get out. It was huge, and we only looked at it for a few seconds before I said, "Let's get out of here now." We hardly started rushing away, and we hear the gravel move closer. And not even a couple of seconds later, we both hear the most demonic, horrifying, multiple-pitched screech, literally right behind our heads. It came no more than a foot behind us. So of course, we book it to his car. And no, we did not look back because, are you kidding me? We had to get out of there. We got to his car, funnily enough. As we were trying to get out of there, his lanyard got stuck on the steering wheel, causing us to get even more panicked and freak out even more. All we could do is just shout obscenities over and over. And that's my encounter with the Mothman. Now, a week later, after hanging out with one of our other friends, they told us a story about some interesting things since they spent a lot of time in those woods. He was telling us about how last week, the cops were out there in the woods because they heard screams and thought somebody was being, attacked. Now I asked him if they had helicopters out, and he said yes. And I asked him what day it was, and it was the same night we saw the Goat Man. So, we told him our experience, and he was like, "Yeah, that was probably him you saw, the Goat Man." So, as a kid, I lived about 100 miles away from the nearest town at a house without electricity or running water, which is the works in the Colorado Rockies. This place was in the absolute middle of nowhere, and we frequently saw all kinds of wild animals, ranging from elk, deer, coyotes, and cats. Our property, and a bunch of other neighbors' properties, bordered national forest roads, so to keep people off our road, we had to get about 1.5 miles from our house that we drove through before we reached our house. This time of year, we were the only people up there, as all the other homes were hunting cabins long empty by this time in late winter. Now, this was not the type of gate that you could drive around if you forgot your key. There were tons of trees all around it, with barbed wire, ditches and such. So anyone wanting to go off-road around it would basically have to build a new road around this gate. Well, one night, my mother, brother, sister, and I got up to the gate, and we couldn't find the key. It's gone. So one of us, that is, me, has to walk all the way back up to her house in the pitch black to fetch the spare key and make their way back down. Now, it's recently snowed in January, and it is totally dark. You can't even see your hands in front of you dark, and with the new snow, you can't hear anything either. There are a few clouds in the sky on and off to let some starlight through every once in a while, but it's dark, and of course there isn't a flashlight either. So off I go. First, you walk through around 200 meters of trees. Then it opens up to a huge meadow, which then narrows back down again to trees for another 200 meters, and then opens up again into another huge meadow, which, on the other side of, is our house. I set out, and everything seems fine. I'm just irritated that I have to do this. I'm about 15 years old at the time, and a little angsty teen that is peeved off at the slightest chore. I was not thinking about my surroundings in the slightest, but as I'm walking, I get that feeling that I'm being watched. As I'm halfway through the first meadow, that deep, creepy dread that something is right behind you and you can't see what it is, made it 1,000 times worse by the lack of light and lack of being able to hear. My first instinct was to run, but I knew that if there was something, I was just going to provoke it. So I kept going, and then stopped to try and listen as I heard a crunch echoing my footsteps. Holy shit. This time I walked a little faster, and I knew there was something behind me. It was probably a cat as well. So I just kept walking right into the second bunch of trees before it opened up into a meadow. I could see our house. I could feel the pressure. At this point, we were predator and prey, and I could feel the breath on my shoes. So, the second clearing comes up, and I know what the plan is, and I'm about to book it. Thankfully, unfamiliar with what to do, I scream as loud as I can. As I do so, my dogs hear me, and they run to chase whatever it is from behind me. They continue running past me, and I book it into the house. When I get in, I grab the 12-gauge first and the key second, then pick up the tractor keys and jump in. There was no way I was going to walk that again. As I'm driving back towards the gate, I see the dogs running back. At least they weren't hurt. That could have been extremely dangerous. I also see the tracks. I knew it was a cat. He actually started approaching me from the first meadow and was tailing me for a long time. I tell my family the whole story, and I know that I'm not going to get any sleep tonight. From that day, I refused to be out alone at night in the countryside without a weapon. This all took place when I was 14. It was a Saturday, and we were going camping in one of the more rural parts of Jamaica. I won't name the place for privacy reasons, but first, here's some background. As I said, I'm 14 years old, about 5'3" in a medium frame build. In other words, I was a big kid. Anyway, back to the story. Where we were going from where we lived was about an hour and a half worth of driving. When we get there, we get our stuff from the truck and started hiking to a good spot. We come across a nice, calm, crisp-looking stream, so we decided to stop, get our fishing poles out, and get some dinner right away. About 2 hours later, we pack up and start again. By now, it's about 4:30 p.m., and we finally find a good enough spot and set up. Suddenly, we pick up this awful, pungent stench. It's honestly like expired sour cream and rotten eggs mixed in a toilet that hadn't been cleaned for years and left in the sun. I felt chills go down my spine and a wave of dread rush over me when I heard the most shrillest, ear-piercing screech I'd ever heard in my life. I grabbed the sawed-off double-barrel shotgun and ran inside the tent. I fell asleep quickly despite it being only 6 p.m., but at about 2 a.m., I had awoken to the sound of a branch snapping. To make matters worse, I had to pee very bad. Me being a horror movie enthusiast, I knew all too well what could be happening in this situation. I laid still with my double-barrel shotgun in my hand, ready to fire if it came to the test. Fast forward about 10 minutes later, when I heard my uncle scream. I quickly woke my dad up, who was sleeping next to me, and slowly walked out of the tent, thinking he was just trying to play a trick on us. Nothing could have ever prepared me for what I saw. This thing was at least 8 feet tall. It had the smell that I described earlier. It had 2 horns sticking out of its head, but they were deformed looking. I don't know how to explain it. It stood on 2 awfully man-like legs. I thought I was in hell, looking at the devil himself. It probably wasn't more than a second or two before I fired a shot at this thing's leg. It jolted back, so human-like, a little too human-like. Then it happened. This thing turned around and acknowledged us, almost as if it wanted to speak, and it kind of did. I don't exactly remember what it said or what it sounded like, I should say, but it spoke in a deep, raspy voice. I remember it had hellish red gleaming eyes that stared through my soul. Then I shot it again, this time in the back of its disgusting devil-like back, covered with white, dirty, disgusting-looking fur. After about 5 seconds or so, the thing ran off into the woods, leaving a trail of blood. I looked over at my uncle. He was almost in tears, and so was my dad. They were both frozen in fear. I don't know what the heck it was, and I don't know how I wasn't in fear either. We all stayed in one tent, packing our stuff up and planning to book it back to the truck as soon as the sun came up. After about 7 hours, the sun finally came up, and we did as planned. When we got to the truck, we started to drive out of there like bats out of hell. On the ride home, we didn't say a word, nor did we when we got home. You'd think the story ends here. Well, not all fairy tales have happy endings. About 2 weeks later, we went down to the countryside to look for my aunt, uncle, and cousins. The drive was about 3 hours away from where we lived, so we were going to spend the night with them. When we got there, we saw them all standing in the front patio waiting for us with a look of joy on their faces. Now, to describe the place, it was about a 5-acre empty woodland area, but it had great lighting around the house from the LED solar-powered lights. Anyway, after about 10 minutes of walking and catching up, we all went inside and made our way to the bathrooms to freshen up. When I finished, I got out and made my way to the room I was staying in. My 2 cousins, Brian and Mario, who were both 6 at the time, came in and wanted to play Forza. When it was about 10 p.m., I decided that I was going to bed. I said my goodnights and went up to the room. It was dark, but I did not bother to turn on the light. I just went straight over to the bed and tucked in. I heard the door open, but I just brushed it off as my cousins. About 2 hours later, Mario comes in, turns on the light, and screams. I will never forget the look on his face. When I asked what's wrong, he looked at me as if he had just killed someone accidentally. It was almost as if he wanted to say, "Oops," and started raging. He was in total awe. It was the thing from earlier. It just walked over to the open window, which was about 2 stories off the ground, made its way down, and walked away into the woods like nothing ever happened. It moved so human-like, so disgusting, so purposely. When everyone ran up to us and asked what happened, when we finished telling them the story, Brian simply said, "Goat man." Fortunately, this was the last time I personally had an experience with this creature, and I hope I never will again. But sometimes, I still wonder what would have happened if I turned on the light, or if Mario didn't come in when he did, or if he had laid down next to this thing without bothering to turn on the light. I'm glad I don't know. This all took place when I was 14. It was a Saturday, and we were going camping in one of the more rural parts of Jamaica. I won't name the place for privacy reasons, but first, here's some background. As I said, I'm 14 years old, about 5'3" in a medium frame build. In other words, I was a big kid. Anyway, back to the story. Where we were going from where we lived was about an hour and a half worth of driving. When we get there, we get our stuff from the truck and started hiking to a good spot. We come across a nice, calm, crisp-looking stream, so we decided to stop, get our fishing poles out, and get some dinner right away. About 2 hours later, we pack up and start again. By now, it's about 4:30 p.m., and we finally find a good enough spot and set up. Suddenly, we pick up this awful, pungent stench. It's honestly like expired sour cream and rotten eggs mixed in a toilet that hadn't been cleaned for years and left in the sun. I felt chills go down my spine and a wave of dread rush over me when I heard the most shrillest, ear-piercing screech I'd ever heard in my life. I grabbed the sawed-off double-barrel shotgun and ran inside the tent. I fell asleep quickly despite it being only 6 p.m., but at about 2 a.m., I had awoken to the sound of a branch snapping. To make matters worse, I had to pee very bad. Me being a horror movie enthusiast, I knew all too well what could be happening in this situation. I laid still with my double-barrel shotgun in my hand, ready to fire if it came to the test. Fast forward about 10 minutes later, when I heard my uncle scream. I quickly woke my dad up, who was sleeping next to me, and slowly walked out of the tent, thinking he was just trying to play a trick on us. Nothing could have ever prepared me for what I saw. This thing was at least 8 feet tall. It had the smell that I described earlier. It had 2 horns sticking out of its head, but they were deformed looking. I don't know how to explain it. It stood on 2 awfully man-like legs. I thought I was in hell, looking at the devil himself. It probably wasn't more than a second or two before I fired a shot at this thing's leg. It jolted back, so human-like, a little too human-like. Then it happened. This thing turned around and acknowledged us, almost as if it wanted to speak, and it kind of did. I don't exactly remember what it said or what it sounded like, I should say, but it spoke in a deep, raspy voice. I remember it had hellish, red, gleaming eyes that stared through my soul. Then I shot it again, this time in the back of its disgusting devil-like back, covered with white, dirty, disgusting-looking fur. All of this takes place on Vancouver Island. My name is Cameron, I'm 17, and it was about 2 years ago now, at the beginning of June, when my friends and I went up to the island to go camping. We camped out on the sandy beach with the woods behind us. The first night there wasn't much activity. It was just the sound of waves, which was pretty calming. But on the second night, before we went to sleep, we were all around the campfire when, after a while, we started to hear bats and got freaked out. So, we went into the tent and joined the others and told scary stories. By the time I had started to get paranoid, I tried to calm myself with music and drifted off to sleep. But every 2 to 3 hours, I would get up for absolutely no reason. It was probably between 3 to 4 in the morning when I woke up, took my headphones off, and heard someone or something walking around outside on the sand. It didn't sound like an animal walking on its 4 legs, but more like someone heavy walking on 2 feet. And after a while, I fell back asleep. It started to rain during the night, so I didn't get to investigate to see if there were any footprints. Thankfully, we had already planned to leave that day. But it got me thinking, what if it was a Bigfoot? It couldn't have been someone else from another campsite since we were quite far away from anyone else. And it couldn't have been anyone from our group since it was 4 in the morning, and everyone was already sound asleep. Was Bigfoot the reason why I was so paranoid before going to sleep? Anyway, just think about that. Now, I've got another story. All of this has been happening for almost a year. I also want to point out that I live by a small town near the native reserve. My house, where I live, is on the reserve side and has bushes at the back of the house. So, we would always hear of bear sightings and cougar sightings around here, but I've never heard any of those at the time this happened. I've lived here in the same house for almost my entire life and never had any experiences like these before. One night, I was trying to sleep downstairs in the living room on the couch. The couch is right next to the window, and our backyard at the time didn't have a fence around the garden or yard, although we do have a wooden porch we made. I was trying to sleep on the couch when I heard something move in the bush and turned off my music to listen. And I hear it happen for a few seconds. And the next few minutes, I hear what sounds like someone heavy walking on the wooden porch. After a while, it stops. But a few seconds later, I hear 2 taps on the window. So, I run upstairs. All of this happened around Christmas at 1 going into 2 in the morning. Every few nights in summer, I would hear something move in the bush, like someone walking around big tree branches. I've never gone back there to take a look, but I've noticed an almost dead tree taken down somehow. It's never windy in the summer, so someone or something must have done that. Usually every morning, my mom would open our back door to let our dog out in the back to use the washroom. At this time, we have a fence around the garden and yard and have 2 gates, one to get into the backyard that we can open from the side of the house, and one to get into the garden. So my mom lets our dog out, but the yard gate is open. My mom goes out to start the car for work, and my dog's there running around, smiling. My mom was confused because we had the yard gate closed, and we didn't have anyone over the past night. No one else knew how to open this particular gate, but our very close friends and family. Another morning, I was awake with my mom, and she opened the back door to let the dog out, but found the garden gate was already open, and no one should have been there. A few days passed by, and I went out for a ride with my mom to town for some groceries. On the way back, I told her about the noise in the bush. She turned down the radio and started talking in a serious tone. She said that there had been stories from up on the island about Bigfoot, and that he's a part of our culture. We talked a bit, and she mentioned the gates opening without any of us using them, and we both started to get suspicious as we drove home. This happened another night after I came home from work. I usually go upstairs right away and chill on my bed. This time, I heard something moving in the bushes again, but I pushed it off as nothing and went downstairs to open my can of fruit. As I went into the kitchen from the living room and looked outside, for a split second, I saw what I thought were 2 yellow eyes behind the fence at shoulder height. I didn't realize until I got upstairs. The next morning I went downstairs and looked out the window to see if anything was there, and there was nothing out of the ordinary. We have solar-powered light bulbs in the back, but they don't really work all the time. They're blue and dim and weren't as bright as the eyes. There weren't any lights on the fence, and I saw them much brighter. Nothing much has happened since, but I do believe there's a Bigfoot that lives on this island. This was sometime in 2015. I'd gone camping with a couple of friends. This was probably the third time I'd ever been camping. We were at a pay-to-stay campground. We were even staying in a tiny cabin by a big lake, so it wasn't like we were out in the wild. Now back then, I used to get panic attacks sometimes for no reason. For some reason, despite my immense love for nature, ever since my first camping trip, I would often get a panic attack when camping. I couldn't tell you why for the life of me. Well, that night I had one, and it was severe to the point where I felt like I could not breathe if I stayed in a cabin. But I would get scared if I stayed outside alone, so I had a lot of back and forth, and my poor friends put up with me. At one point, I had stepped outside with one of them, my significant other at the time, and was trying to calm down and wondering where I could go pee. My significant other had a flashlight and was leading me to a spot in the dirt at the edge of the trees between our two parked cars. He reasoned it was a good enough distance from the cabin, and yet not in the middle of the woods where some critter could catch me with my pants down. So I agreed, and that's when I saw it. I can still remember. I could barely see the lake from the distance. I stepped past the first car and looked between, and there, at the edge of the woods where it meets the lake, I could see something. It looked like a creature. There was minimal light, so I could barely see its silhouette, but I could tell it was not human. It was so strange because it was silent. The creature had the general body shape of what looked like a dog, but its colors and features were more like a hyena, but also like an aquatic monster. It was almost like it was a fusion between the two. I could definitely tell it was capable of living and moving on land, but it also had features that made it look very much like it swam and spent a lot of time in the water. I stood there, perfectly still, watching this thing slowly emerge from the water. I only saw its torso and head and the front of its legs. The thing I'll never get over is its face. It looked like it was frozen in time, with a jaw wide open revealing sharp, bright teeth. Its eyes were looking right at me, but its nose wasn't wrinkled like a snarl, and there was no growling. There was no sound at all. It was the oddest thing. It sent an instant deep ball of dread down into my core. After I froze for a long moment, I grabbed my significant other's arm and urgently whispered for them to go back in the cabin. I forgot to mention that this thing's eyes were glowing, more than likely reflecting the light we had in the cabin, and the other two friends were asleep, so my significant other didn't see whatever I saw. I'm pretty sure I'll ask him eventually, but I couldn't sleep that night with my panic, and now the sight of what I eventually know is to be some sort of water monster. I just could not feel safe. Eventually, I went and slept in my car because apparently in my brain, that just seemed like the safest place to be.